Hi, everyone. My name is Jonathan Evans. I'm a researcher at Pew Research Center, and I'm really excited to be here with you today sharing results from a project we've been running for the last few years, studying religion in India. Let me first pull up my presentation so we can all follow along together. All right, here we are. So thank you to Tanenbaum for inviting me to present this research and to all of you for joining. And first wanted to share a little information on who and what the Pew Research Center is. So we are a team of researchers. We are a nonprofit, non-partisan, non-advocacy research organization. And this means, among other things, that we don't take policy positions. Pew Research Center studies many different topics, and the team I am on, we specifically focus on religion. The center's primary funding source is the Pew Charitable Trust, but for large projects such as this one, we do seek additional funding from outside foundations, and this study's additional funding came from the John Templeton Foundation. They've long supported the center's working to understand religious change around the world and how that impacts societies. We, as a broader organization, we provide data as a public good to enrich public discussions. And we don't have clients or advertisers. You can't commission a study from Pew Research Center. All of our research ends up being freely available on our website, pewresearch.org, and that includes the report I'll be talking about today. Now, the team I'm on, we study religion specifically because it plays a meaningful role in people's lives, and by extension in local, national, and even international communities. We don't promote religion in general or any specific religion. We're simply studying how people practice their religion, how they believe, and how that intersects with other things in their lives. We've previously studied religion all over the world, places like the Americas, Europe, Africa, the Middle East. This survey of religion in India, however, it's our largest single country survey that we've ever done outside the United States. We conducted interviews with nearly 30,000 adults all across India over several months at the end of 2019 into the early part of 2020. We did have to end a little early due to the COVID-19 pandemic emerging. We had to end before we got to two of the smaller states in the Northeast. And we also were unable to interview in the Kashmir Valley due to the security lockdown that was underway at the time. But even with those exclusions, our survey is nationally representative of 98% of India's adult population. And to do this work, it took nearly 200 teams of interviewers and supervisors in the field. They did interviews in 17 languages all across the country. And did want to point out that the survey took about 45 minutes for each respondent to go through it. So it's far more data than I can cover in our presentation today, but would highly encourage you to check out the full report later so you can see other interesting findings. But diving into specifically what we found, the religious composition of India, this is based on the census, but obviously it's a majority Hindu country with sizable populations of Muslims, Christians, and other communities. But we didn't want to only talk about, say, Hindus and Muslims. We wanted to be able to talk about the attitudes of smaller communities as well, even Buddhists and Jains, who make up less than 1% of the national population. So we designed our survey in such a way that we would have enough people to talk about their attitudes. Now, we also got people who said that they don't have a religion or that are from another religion than what we've listed here. We did interview them, but we didn't have enough of those people to talk about their attitudes separately. So you won't see them broken out in any of the future slides. But the main findings of this survey center around religious tolerance and religious segregation. And these may seem somewhat paradoxical, that there really is this overwhelming Indian commitment to religious tolerance as a core value, but at the same time, a strong desire for religious segregation. What it suggests to us is that there is a concept of pluralism more akin to a patchwork quilt, perhaps, than a melting pot. Broadly, Indians could be said to be living together separately, or that is their desire. And this desire for religious segregation does overlap with commonly discussed fault lines in national identity, in politics, in broader Indian society. And I want to tackle each of these three topics in my presentation today. So first, let's talk about the Indian commitment to tolerance. Now, Indians overwhelmingly feel very free to practice their own religion. This is true no matter which religious community they're a part of, whether they're in the majority or in one of these smaller communities. Separately, they also say that other Indians, they think, they're very free to practice their religions. This broad perception of religious freedom, it's reflected in what Indians identify as core civic and religious values. We find that large shares across all the religious communities say things that, all religions should be respected. That's an important part of being truly Indian. It's also an important part of being a member of your own religious community. So for example, Hindus were asked how important different things were to being a Hindu, and one of them was how important was it to respect other religions. And yeah, we see that many in all these communities say that these are very important things. And to some extent, this respect carries over to shared beliefs and practices. So showing two of them here, karma is something that clearly comes from a Hindu background in Hinduism. It doesn't have a basis in something like the Quran, but both in the Hindu and Muslim community, we see 3/4 saying that they believe in karma. And the Ganges River having a power to purify also is based in Hindu teachings and traditions. Very high belief among the Hindu community, but we also find that 1/3 of Christians say that they believe the Ganges has this power. Similarly, we see Hindus who celebrate Eid and celebrate Christmas. So there are some similarities across the different communities, some sharing of beliefs and practices. However, Indians largely perceive that their communities are very different from each other. Looking first at Hindus and Muslims, we find that overwhelmingly they're leaning towards this very different from other groups. We asked them, are you this very different from, or do you have a lot in common with each of the other communities in India? And we see that roughly 2/3 of Hindus and Muslims said that they are very different from each other's communities. And generally speaking, Indians from other religious communities have the same leaning, that they lean towards saying that they have a very different experience than what other people have. And this is true whether or not people would be considered theologically, the religions themselves would be considered theologically the same or different. But we do see a difference in two communities, in the Jains and the Sikhs. There is a leaning towards having a lot in common with the Hindu community in India. And this perception broadly of religious differences between the communities on the ground, it's reflected in practices that maintain religious segregation in India. So we can see this in several different measures that we were able to ask about in our survey. And one example I'd like to share is on interreligious marriage. So 2/3 of Hindus say that it is very important to stop women, and separately to stop men from marrying outside of their religion. The shares are even greater among the Muslim community in India. The only community where minorities say it's very important is the Christian and Buddhist communities. And even in both of those, when you consider also the people who say it's somewhat important, those shares in the Christian and Buddhist community increase to being a majority as well. So there is widespread support for stopping interreligious marriages. We also see a desire for religious segregation in how people live with their friends. We see that majorities in all the communities say that all or most of their close friends are from the same religious community. Nearly 9 in 10 Muslims say this, and this is true even from some of the smallest communities in India. So for example, Jains, again, who make up less than 1% of the national population, but nearly 3/4 of them say that all or most of their close friends come from the Jain community. When we asked people about their neighborhoods, though, fewer Indians went so far as to say that their neighborhoods should only include people from their own religious group. But still, we find that notable shares among Hindus and Muslims do want to restrict who their neighbors are, at least to some extent. We asked respondents a series of questions. Would you be willing to accept a blank as a neighbor? And we asked several times, a Muslim as a neighbor, a Sikh as a neighbor, and asked them about all the communities except for their own. And among both Hindus and Muslims, we find that roughly a quarter say that they would be unwilling to accept Sikhs or Buddhists or Jains as their neighbors. And this pattern we also see broadly among the other communities in India. Now, I want to draw your attention to the last column where we can see the answers, the responses that the Jains gave. We'll find the majority of Jains said that they were unwilling to have Muslim neighbors. But at the same time, only 3% of Jains said this about Hindus. So many more said that they would be willing to accept a Hindu as a neighbor. But we didn't just want to look at the level of desired segregation or what they're experiencing in their friendship circles. We wanted to see if these attitudes and experiences carry over into other topics in the national discussion. So mainly want to talk now about national identity and politics. And primarily, for now, to look in at the Hindu community. We can see that many Hindus, most Hindus, strongly tie religious identity to national identity, saying that it is very important to be Hindu to be truly Indian. 2/3 saying this, and still a majority saying that it's very important to be able to speak Hindi to be truly Indian, even though, of course, there are dozens of languages that are widely spoken in India. These two views are highly correlated, with a majority saying that these two aspects of national identity, or potential aspects of national identity, are crucial. And this all connects into politics. We started fieldwork in late 2019, shortly after the parliamentary elections. And so we asked people who they voted for. And we found that roughly half of Hindus in India said that they had voted for the BJP in the most recent elections. But when we take into consideration people's views on national identity, we see that it's not a uniform distribution across all Hindus. We find that a majority of Hindus who said that they think that religious and national identity are very closely tied, we find the majority saying that they voted for the BJP, but that share decreases to 1/3 among the Hindus who said that it's not important, Hindu identity and as part of national identity. It's not an important part of that. And we would see a similar pattern if, instead of the bars I've shown you, if I were to show what happens if we compare across people's attitudes who said different things about the Hindi language. That again, people who tie the Hindi language very strongly to national identity were more likely to vote for the BJP. And these three factors, being Hindu, speaking Hindi, as both of those as part of Indian identity, and then voting for the BJP, these three are closely correlated. And 30% of Hindu voters did all three of these things, or said all three of these things. And we find that this category, these people who did all three of these things, tend to prefer a greater degree of religious segregation across several measures. So on the right side of this, you can see the group that I was just talking about, who voted for the BJP and had that particular view of what Indian national identity is, and then as compared to other Hindu voters. So for example, a majority of people who voted for the BJP and said that Hindu identity is tied to national identity and the Hindi language is very importantly tied to national identity, 57% of them saying that all their close friends are Hindu, whereas that drops to 43% among other Hindu voters. And these same people who place this strong emphasis on religious identity and linguistic identity, however, are more likely to express a positive opinion about India's religious diversity, which you can see at the bottom of the slide here. 2/3 of this group say that religious diversity benefits India as opposed to harming the country. And this is in contrast to about half of other Hindu voters who voice this opinion. This finding may suggest that for many Hindus, there is not a contradiction between valuing religious diversity, but also feeling that Hindus are somewhat more authentically Indian than fellow citizens who are not Hindu. Among Indians overall, there's no overwhelming consensus on the benefits of religious diversity. We do see that on balance, 53% of Indians saying that diversity is beneficial, but it's not an overwhelming share. Now, even with this widespread desire for religious segregation, all of India's major religious communities are highly observant. Another way that there is some overlap and similarity, perhaps, even if people on the ground don't view it as such. For instance, the vast majority of Indians across all major faiths say that religion is very important in their lives. Similarly, 3/4 or more in all of these communities say that they know a great deal about their religion and its practices. We also asked several questions about religious rites of passage, things that might happen at birth or marriage or death. And members from all of these religious communities tend to see these as highly important practices. This is a very religiously engaged society across all the different faith communities. Now, a standard measure that we ask is about belief in God. And we find that the vast majority of Indians do believe in God, many of them with absolute certainty. For example, 98% of Indian Hindus say that they believe in God. The big exception, you'll notice, of course, towards the bottom is the Buddhist community, where only 2/3 say that they believe in God. But even among this community, most who do say there is a God say that they believe in God with absolute certainty. We've asked this question, like I mentioned, all around the world, but on this survey, we wanted to make sure that we asked some additional questions about belief in God in an Indian context. So one I'll share with you now is about the type of deity that people believe in. We asked them if everyone who said they believe in God, we asked them, do they believe in only one God with many manifestations, or many gods? Most Hindus and Jains, you'll see, believe that there is one God with many manifestations. In contrast, we see among the other communities that they lean towards saying that there is only one God. Now, what I've shared with you, as I mentioned at the outset, is only a handful of the findings from this study. Other topics from the report talk about things like caste, regional differences, things like yoga, and the report website you can see there at the bottom, pewresearch.org/India survey. I highly encourage you to check that out. Thank you again for taking the time to listen to me today and hopefully to check out the report. It's always a pleasure to present to this group every time we're invited. And a reminder that all of our research, not just this report, is available at pewresearch.org. It's publicly available and free for you to share with others. So thank you again and have a great rest of the conference.